We're learning that West Texas could be home to a nuclear dump of sorts. It seems that the Texas Environment Commission has approved a plan to allow some types of nuclear waste to be deposited in an area within shouting distance of New Mexico. That has some environmentalists concerned. Adam Greenwood is one of them and has created an organization named Save the Ogallala. That's an aquifer that sits below the area of the dump. It's also beneath a portion of New Mexico and other western states that draw water from it. I asked Greenwood to talk about the issue.
Here's the situation. An aquifer is, of course, just underground water. It's used for drinking, for growing crops. And just across the border, about a half mile from New Mexico, there's a toxic waste dump that's above the aquifer. Now, due to some, I don't want to say machinations, but a lot of lobbying, a lot of political donations, there's a billionaire in Texas by the name of Harold Simmons who's convinced the legislature to allow him to have a license to put radioactive waste above that aquifer. There's a lot of concerns that's going to contaminate the aquifer. In fact, the Texas agency that was supposed to evaluate his radioactive dump and decide whether it was safe or not, well, it turns out that the agency staffers said there was no way it could be made safe. And when the director of the agency went ahead and decided to grant the permit anyway, 3 of them resigned in protest. Now, to me, that raises a lot of red flags.
Now, what they plan to dump there, you say, is nuclear waste. Didn't they also plan to dump sludge from back east, New Jersey, or places like that?
Well, not only are they planning to do it, my understanding is they've already started to do that. You're talking about the PCBs from the Hudson River?
Exactly.
There's something like 2.5 million cubic yards is the figure I've seen of cancer-causing chemicals that are being relocated from the Hudson to this dump on the Texas-New Mexico border. Now, I can understand why people wouldn't want it in the Hudson River, but no one drinks Hudson River water. People do drink from the Ogallala Aquifer. I've seen some government figures saying that there's over a million people who get their drinking water from that aquifer. I'm thinking maybe there'd be a better location than drinking water supplies.
They probably would have run into trouble if they wanted to put it in New Mexico, don't you think? And is that why they situated it just over the border in Texas?
I think that makes sense to me. There's a different political environment in this state than there is in Texas, and certainly when you're talking about lobbyists and campaign donations, the people who are behind Waste Control Specialists, that's the company that owns the dump, have a lot more influence in Texas than they do here. Let me tell you about something that's been particularly troubling to me that I just discovered recently. There's been some reportage in the Houston Chronicle and a newspaper called the Texas Observer that says the executive director of the Texas agency that was supposed to grant the permit, the gentleman who overrode his staff and decided to let this go ahead, he quit, and he's now working for Waste Control Specialist on a $100,000 to $150,000 contract. Now, maybe that tells you why it's in Texas instead of New Mexico. You'll have to draw your own conclusions. But to me, I look at that and I smell a rat.
Now, the people in Eunice, New Mexico, right near that border area, say they're not really bothered by the sludge dump. I don't know if they know yet about the nuclear dump, but they say it could mean more economic business for them in New Mexico.
I've seen some of those reports, and I certainly understand why people would be concerned about the economy in this time and why they would be concerned about jobs. But I think there's another way of looking at it, and that is that in hard economic times in particular is no time to be creating problems that are later going to have to be cleaned up at taxpayer expense. There is such a thing as being too short-sighted when you think about your economy and your financial welfare, and I think potentially creating a major source of contamination of drinking water that will later have to be cleaned up, probably at taxpayer expense, is one of those ways.
Now, state boundaries are artificial things. As you say, aquifers cover broader areas and aren't restricted by state boundaries.
Excellent point, Bill.
I'm sorry?
an excellent point.
Now, do state officials in New Mexico have anything to say about this dump? Have they been asked by you or others?
No, and that's something I'm considering, but you make an excellent point that all those state boundaries are artificial. They do come into play, and there's only a limited amount that New Mexico state officials can do. My hope, anyway, is that initially we can just bring pressure into Texas to get the Texas legislature to reconsider what they've done, and that would bypass any need for interstate squabbles. But if Texas won't listen to reason, it's certainly true that they're making decisions in that state that affect people here in New Mexico, in Oklahoma, Colorado, and multiple other states, and they shouldn't be able to do that without consultation and without taking our interest into account.
What timeline is this nuclear dump operating on? When will they do it?
My understanding is that they just this week, or perhaps the week before, have already started taking some shipments from a company called Studzik in Tennessee. Now, they're claiming that these shipments are only temporary, that they're just going to store them for a little while. But I've seen reports from their spokesman that say what they mean by temporary is indefinitely. And as you and I both know, indefinitely isn't temporary. They're also in making arrangements to take shipments from Texas, from Vermont. It's going to start happening very soon unless someone in the Texas legislature or in the federal government decides to put the brakes on and say, well, let's take another look at this before we do anything we can't reverse.
Adam Greenwood of the organization Save the Ogallala. New Mexico Environment Department officials have not been available to tell us whether they could exercise any influence over that dump.